Section 16 of Seen and Unseen. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Piotr. Seen and Unseen by Katharine Bates. A Second Visit to India, 1903. My second visit to India took place in the early months of 1903, and I approached it this time from Burma. Fielding Hall's Soul of a People had thrown its magic spell over me, and Miss Greenlow and I were both anxious also to see the far-famed Shwe Dagon temple. I came to the conclusion from what I saw, and still more from what I heard, that Mr. Fielding Hall must have appealed sometimes to his imagination for his facts, and allowed an exquisite poetical fancy to cast its glamour even over these. But the beautiful Golden Temple of Rangoon defies all powers of exaggeration. We went there again and again, and wandered amongst its endless small temples, representing various forms of worship, including even a Chinese joss house, which is stamped upon my memory through a disaster which I have always connected with this special temple, rank superstition though it be. We had spent several weeks upon the Irrawaddy River, had wandered through beautiful dusty Mandalay, had explored Bhamo and marvelled over the exquisite visions of fairy-like beauty painted anew for us morning and evening on this most glorious river, and had finally returned to Rangoon for a few days' rest before starting for Calcutta. It was an exquisite evening just before our departure, when we went, towards sunset, to say farewell to the Shwe Dagon. At that hour it is to be seen at its best, for the level rays of the eastern sun light up the golden cupola into startling and fairy-like magnificence. Having watched this glorious spectacle for some minutes, the air grew chilly compared with the intense heat of the day, and darkness was coming on apace as we turned to retrace our steps. A few days before we had noticed a Chinese joss house standing in one corner of the huge elevated platform upon which the Shwe Dagon rests. In the maze of buildings, and owing to the swiftly falling darkness, we could not at once locate this temple, and most unfortunately for me, with the stupid persistence which such a failure sometimes brings, both Miss Greenlow and I were determined to find it out before leaving the Golden Temple. At last a joyous exclamation warned me that my friend had been successful in her quest. The first time I had seen this joss house I had run up the steps heedlessly, but felt such an unpleasant influence on entering it that I came away at once, and only regret not having been equally prudent a second time. Miss Greenlow was gazing at some grotesque carvings in one corner of the temple, still dimly visible, and called out to me to come and look at them also. Very reluctantly I joined her, and stood for a few minutes waiting, till she was ready to leave. There was something so gloomy, so uncanny and depressing, I must even say malignant, in the building at this twilight hour, that I could stand the influence no longer, and as Miss Greenlow seemed inclined to linger, I hurried down the stone steps, saying, "I can't stay in that place, I will wait for you at the top of the marble stairs." Now these steps, broken and dirty, and lined by small booths selling every imaginable toy and bit of tinsel, including small models of the various temples, led by steep flights up and down from the huge platform of ground I have mentioned. Some small link boys were crowding round as Miss Greenlow rejoined me, clamouring to be allowed to light us down the steps, a very necessary precaution, for the darkness was quickly replacing the exquisite sunset colouring. I am, as a rule, rather a remarkably sure-footed person, and the lanterns of the boys threw ample light upon the steps, yet the first moment of my descent I was considerably surprised to find myself at the bottom of the first whole flight of hard marble steps. I had no recollection of a slip even. One moment I was standing, carefully prepared to descend, the next I was lying on my back at the bottom of a long flight of steps, with the link boys gaping in astonishment. They could not have been more astonished than I was. The very swiftness of the fall was probably my salvation, otherwise I think my spine must have been injured. As it was, I was very much hurt, however. The pain was intense for a time, and the muscles of my back were so swollen that they stood up in ridges as big as a good-sized finger for some time after the escapade. In fact, it was quite 6 weeks before our local trouble was over, and many more weeks before I had recovered from the unexpected shock. I have had several falls in my life, but never one other where there was absolutely no preliminary warning or sense of slipping, however swift. The experience was exactly that of being suddenly hurled down the steps by some outside force. I can only add that I deeply deplored my unguarded words to Miss Greenlow when I told her I was sure there was some malignant spirit in the Joss house. Perhaps he wished politely to demonstrate the correctness of my remark. The short voyage from Rangoon to Calcutta was made pleasant by the kindness of a European friend in Rangoon who came to see us off, and asked if he should introduce to me a little Burmese lady, very rich and very devotee, who was on board with us, going to Calcutta, to pay a visit to her husband, who lived in that city. "She's one of our principal native residents," my Rangoon friend explained to me before introducing her. "She is also intensely interested in her Buddhist religion, and I think this may interest you, from what you have told me of your investigations." So the little lady was duly presented, and thinking to open our conversation pleasantly, I remarked that Mr. Rowell had told me that she was much interested in religious questions, and although not a theosophist myself, I numbered several of them amongst my friends. But I found myself quite on the wrong track. She screwed up her little mouth, as if tasting some nasty medicine, and then said in excellent colloquial English: "Oh, they are no good at all. They have muddled everything up, and got it all wrong. This is why we are beginning to write tracts and send out missionaries. The great Buddha made no propaganda. Neither did we for many, many centuries. We believe that people must grow into this knowledge. But now, when you, Western people, come and take little bits of our system and piece them together all wrong, well, then we are forced to show you what is the truth. It's like a puzzle map, and all you theosophists are trying to fit the pieces in, wrong side upward." And she finished with a merry and apologetic laugh, remembering, no doubt, that I had spoken of having friends among these "stupid muddlers." She gave me quite a number of the tracts of which she had spoken, setting forth the true Buddhism, and mostly printed in Mandalay, and I made a point of passing these on to some of the friends I had mentioned to her. I can only trust they were appreciated and efficacious in reducing the confusion resulting from trying to adapt Eastern mysticism to Western consumption. Our conversation became still more interesting when I discovered that a mysterious fellow passenger of ours on board the Devonshire, sailing from Marseilles to Rangoon, had taken this voyage at the expense of the Burmese lady, and I am sorry to say had occasioned her a great and quite inexcusable disappointment. This man, whom I will call Dr. Grüne, was a professor at a celebrated university in the south of Europe, and was certainly a scholar, if not a gentleman. He had studied the Buddhist writings very deeply, and his name had been conveyed to this Burmese lady as that of one eager to throw off all the ties of kinship, and retire, like the great Buddha himself, from the world, and find repose and enlightenment in a Burmese monastery. The only thing lacking in carrying out this excellent resolve was, as usual, money. The native lady, delighted to hear of so learned a gentleman, and one holding such an honourable position in Europe, being converted to the tenets of her religion, and thus wishing to give the best example of their influence upon him, agreed joyfully to forward the funds for his journey and to make arrangements for his stay in Rangoon before proceeding to Mandalay, where he was to be received as a Buddhist priest after a certain course of initiation. We had all remarked Dr. Grüne on board, partly because he was so thin and tall and walked the deck so persistently in fine weather or foul, partly because he owned an exceptionally fine and long beard, which parted and waved in the breeze as he passed to and fro in his lonely perambulations. I never saw him speak to any one on board except my own table companion, Dr. Gall, the secretary of the Church Missionary Society, and a very interesting and intelligent man. The latter was also a distinguished Arabic scholar, and had lent me some striking monographs he had written on the Mohammedan faith, striking both by the scholarship and breadth of view and tolerance which one does not generally associate with the society that he represented. I had seen him more than once in the company of Dr. Grüne, and when we reached Colombo, and read in the papers handed to us on board that our ship contained the famous European professor, who was journeying to Mandalay to become a Buddhist priest after a touching farewell with wife and children, Dr. Gall expressed both astonishment and incredulity. "He never said a word about it to me," was his remark. "I know he has studied the Buddhist religion very deeply, and he is anxious to get access to some manuscripts which he hopes to find in Burma, but that is not the same thing as becoming a priest. I expect the papers have exaggerated the facts." As a matter of fact, Dr. Grüne certainly gave a lecture on Buddhism in Colombo on the day of our arrival, for one of our fellow passengers had the curiosity to be present. But he also told me nothing had been said about the lecturer becoming a priest. The matter did not specially interest me, but on arrival at Rangoon the only decent hotel was crowded, and most of us had to put up with a very inferior class of accommodation. A few hours of this establishment sufficed for most of the passengers, who promptly went up country or on the river, but Miss Greenlow and I were obliged to spend 3 or 4 days in Rangoon, and Dr. Grüne was at first our only companion, so of course we spoke to each other in self-defence. He talked of his home life and university work, and casually mentioned the death of his wife 5 years previously, and the children who were awaiting him at home. This certainly tallied more with Dr. Gall's ideas than the sensational Colombo newspaper account of his wife and children, to whom, like the great Buddha, he had bidden an eternal farewell. Naturally, one did not touch upon this delicate subject, but I asked him how long he expected to remain in Rangoon. To my surprise he said at once that his stay was quite uncertain, he might even be returning by the Devonshire, which was to sail within a week of her arrival. It seemed a long and expensive journey to take for so short a stay, but doubtless he had business reasons, and the matter dropped from my mind. When we returned, 3 or 4 weeks later, he was no longer in Rangoon apparently, and I did not expect to come upon his tracks again. The Burmese lady explained the Grüne mystery with some bitterness, and no wonder. Having come out free upon the understanding with her already mentioned, she had taken a room for him at the hotel, and had busied herself in buying blankets and a carpet and other small luxuries to break the Mandalay monastery to him as gently as possible. When 3 days passed and he made no sign of moving on, she quietly intimated that it might be as well to begin the new life without delay, and said she had written to her brother, himself a priest in the monastery, to meet Dr. Grüne at Mandalay and present him to the authorities at the monastery. This must probably have been about the time that I asked him innocently how long he would be staying in Rangoon. His plan had doubtlessly been to go to Mandalay in a dilettante sort of fashion, and to live in the monastery for a time, with the hope of getting access to some valuable and little-known manuscripts. But it did not suit his plans at all to be met at once by the brother of his benefactress, and kept under the eye of this priest, who knew exactly the circumstances under which he had been enabled to take the long journey from Marseilles. Being evidently a prudent man, he determined to seize the first opportunity for retreat from an impossible situation. How he raised enough money for the return voyage is not known. My Burmese acquaintance thought he must have applied to one of the consulates, and that his university position would doubtless ensure his raising a loan. Anyway, he shipped himself surreptitiously once more on board the Devonshire, and arranged that the letter, containing the usual excuse of a sudden telegram from Marseilles announcing the unexpected death of a near relation, should not be handed to his benefactress until the anchor was safely weighed. It was not a pleasant story, and treachery is no less perfidious for having an intellectual motive. I felt glad that Dr. Grüne was not a fellow countryman. Having disburdened herself on this one point of righteous indignation, our little Burmese lady became as bright and cheery as a child, wearing her collection of pretty native dresses, which could all have been packed easily into fair-sized doll's trunk, with a singular grace and charm, When the tender arrived to disembark us in Calcutta, her husband came with it, and was speedily introduced. We had tea with them a few days later in their handsome Calcutta flat, and this gave me the opportunity for a long and interesting talk with the husband, who proved to be a most intelligent and open-minded man. He spoke of Fielding Hall's delightful book with appreciation tinged by kindly amusement. He has been many years in the country, but he still judges us as a foreigner. When I suggested that the judgment was at least very flattering to the Burmese, this Burmese gentleman laughed and said, "Flattering? Yes, but not always quite true. One must see from inside, not from outside, to be quite true in one's judgments, and no foreigner can see from outside. It is a question of race and heredity, not of having spent 20 or 30 years, or even a lifetime, in a foreign land." I suggested that those who saw from inside only might also lack some essential factor in forming an accurate judgment. He agreed heartily to this, adding, "Yes, indeed, the ideal critic must have lived neither too near nor too far, mentally as well as physically. Also he must have intuition. Now, Mr. Fielding Hall is an artist as well as a poet, but in judging my country he lets his intuition run riot sometimes, as well as his imagination." After reporting this conversation, it is unnecessary to add that my Burmese friend spoke English rather better than I did myself. We then talked about the position of women in Burma, and how much this had been extolled and held up as an object lesson to the rest of the world. If the position of woman is the true test of a nation's civilization, as has been so often affirmed, then certainly Burma must be in the van of the nations. Yet this is scarcely borne out by facts. I put this point as politely as I could, and my mind was at once set at ease by the purely impersonal way in which he met my remark. Of course we are not in the van of the nations, and yet it is quite true that our women have an exceptional position, quite a good enough one for an election cry for the women's suffrage. Ah, yes, I have been in England," he added with a merry twinkle in his little black eyes. "But you must realise that the unique position of woman with us is somewhat accidental. It is not the result of philosophical or moral conviction on the part of our men. It has been the natural outcome of circumstances, and a question of expediency rather than of ethics. So it was not really a test paper for us at all. Our frequent wars in the past have taken the men out of their homes, and the women, at such times, were left alone to cope with not only the domestic but the agricultural problems. All business of this kind passed through their hands, and in time they developed the qualities of industry, good judgment, and power of taking responsibility necessary for success in such a life. Then, when the husbands came back and found everything going on so well and without trouble to themselves, they were only too glad to fall in with the existing state of things. We Burmese are lazy fellows after all. We can rise to a big call, but if our women will look after our business for us, we are quite content to smoke our pipes in peace and look on. And of course, the one who makes the wheels go round is the one who really drives the coach. Believe me, there is more of expediency than nobility in the attitude of our men towards our women, and more of laziness than either, perhaps. But Fielding Hall would call this blasphemy, I'm afraid." And so, with a joking word, our interesting talk came to an end, leaving me with a sincere hope that I might some day meet again both the intelligent husband and the charming wife. I found the air at Simla quite marvellous for psychic possibilities, and this was certainly a great surprise to me, nor was it only a question of altitude and a dry atmosphere. Missouri and the Dera Doon are celebrated for the purity of air and climate generally, but the influences there were quite different. Even Peshawar, with its glorious crown of snow-capped mountains, brought no special psychic atmosphere to me, nor the Khyber Pass, where I had thoroughly expected to be haunted by the horrors of the past. Nothing of the kind occurred. The beauty of the day when we visited the historic pass was only to be matched by its own extreme natural beauty, but no haunting memories hung round it for me. Perhaps a night passed in those rocky defiles might have brought some weird experience, But no European would be allowed to woo adventure in this way, even with the laudable desire for advance in psychological phenomena. But I stayed there quite long enough to prove, for the 100th time, that an attitude of expectation acts with me as a deterrent rather than encouragement where the unseen is in question. I had heard so much of Simla society and Simla scandals, and so little of Simla beauty and loveliness, in nature I mean, not human nature. It is true we were there at the most exquisite time in the year, when the air was still fresh and keen, when the last snows and the first blooms of rhododendrons were greeting each other, when the long stretches of valley, brown and purple and emerald green, lay like soft velvet in the immense distances towards the horizon line. As I looked at all this, day after day, it seemed to me that Simla, without its crowds of social butterflies, male and female, and the dust and the flies, and even the heat that they bring with them, was one of the most exquisitely beautiful spots that the great Creator ever thought out in his mind. Nowhere have I seen such a velvety effect of rolling hill and soft mountain side, such gorgeous atmospheric visions, such a carnival of beauty and colour. We must have seen Simla at the most ideal time in the year, or people must become blasé and blinded to its intoxicating beauty, thanks to tennis tournaments and government house receptions and the whole stupid social mill. Not even the beauties of the Kashmir have dimmed the memory of Simla for me, and I would not go there again, and in the season, for anything that could be offered to me. All beauty is sacred, and I guard jealously my sacred memory of the place, known to so many merely as a byword for folly and flirtation. Some strange and curious experiences came to me there, both in automatic writing and other ways, but these are of too private a nature for publication. And so, with the beauty of Simla and the romance of Kashmir as jewels in my memory, I must end my second visit to India. It is said that pleasant as well as painful experiences are apt to run in threes. I trust this may be the case. If so, it will mean that once again I shall tread upon Indian soil. End of section 16. Section 17 of Seen and Unseen. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Piotr. Seen and Unseen by Katharine Bates. Chapter 14. A Family Portrait and Psychic Photography. In the very heart of Warwickshire there is a beautiful old half-timber hall, approached by a noble avenue of elms. The hall has come down from father to son in the direct line for nearly 600 years, as the dates upon the front of the house testify. The present squire is not only an old friend of my early youth, but is connected through marriage, and he and his wife and I have always been on very friendly terms. He is the usual type of fox-hunting squire and county magistrate, did good service during the South African War by raising a corps of yeomanry from the estate, and going out with them to fight his country's battles. And, needless to say, he received a hearty ovation from his wife and his county when he returned to them in safety. He is devoted to his beautiful house and estate, and is the last man to entertain fancies or superstitions in connection with either. It is necessary to give these few words of explanation before relating an incident in my life for which I have always found it difficult to account, except on the supposition that some germ of psychic sensitiveness may exist even under the hunting squire's pink coat and top boots. I have known Greba Hall since I was a child, and all its quaint old family portraits, especially those in the fine oak-panelled hall, with the old-fashioned open fireplace and dogs of the 15th century, but there were so many of these pictures massed together that I have never distinguished one from the other, with the exception of the few immediate ancestors of my friend. Some years ago I was staying with a lady who lived about 3 miles from Greba, and we had driven over there to have tea with the squire's wife, whom I will call Mrs. Lyon. The friend I have mentioned had become interested in psychic matters since my acquaintance with her, and I had discovered that she possessed some psychometric capacity. In the interest of non-psychic readers, I may explain that psychometry is the science of learning to receive impressions and intuitions from the atmosphere surrounding any material object, a letter, a ring, a piece of pebble or shell, and so forth. We seem capable of impressing all material objects with our personality, and naturally this is especially the case in letters written and signed by us. The lady with whom I was then staying, Mrs. Fitzherbert, had tried receiving impressions from letters several times, at my suggestion, and always with more or less success. We had been speaking of this with Mrs. Lyon, who was always very sympathetic, and she suggested giving one of her own letters to Mrs. Fitzherbert to be psychometrized. The letter was sitting facing a door which led from the hall to an inner room, and over this door hung a half-length portrait of an old gentleman, whom I had never specially remarked before, as the picture was hung rather high, and there was nothing very characteristic about the face. Mrs. Fitzherbert glanced at the portrait once or twice as she held the letter, and began her remarks upon the writer, but I had no reason to suppose that the glance was other than casual and accidental. She gave, however, a very remarkably accurate description, as it turned out, of Miss Lyon's unknown friend, both as to his character and the special and rather unique conditions of his life. I was feeling naturally gratified that my pupil should have acquitted herself so well, when she suddenly uttered a little expression of pain, and complained of severe headache. I knew that she suffered from these headaches at times, and was therefore not surprised by her asking leave to ring for the pony carriage at once, and we were soon on our way home. Mrs. Fitzherbert was driving the pony, and as we turned out of the long elm avenue, she murmured in a tone of relief: "How thankful I am to have got away from that old man. I knew he was telling me what to say about that letter. But afterwards he wanted to give me some message himself, and I could not understand it, and that is what made my head so bad." Then she explained, seeing my bewilderment, that she was referring to the old gentleman whose portrait hung over the door I have mentioned. I suggested that we had better try to find out what the old man wanted to say, and we arranged to do so that evening after dinner, but as Mr. Fitzherbert, who had a very charming tenor voice, elected to come in and sing to us, the old gentleman's communication had to be postponed until the morning. Mrs. Fitzherbert and I sat down in the drawing room the next day, armed with pencils and paper, so soon as her domestic duties were over. She was most anxious that I should take the message, but this seemed to me absurd, considering that I had received no sort of impression about the picture, and could not even recall the face. So she took up the pencil very unwillingly, and after some difficulty the name of Richard Lyon was given, with the information that he had owned Greba, and had passed over to the next sphere over 130 years previously. But when it came to trying to find out what he wanted to say, she professed herself quite unable to grasp it, and passed the pencil determinedly over to me. Much to my surprise, for I had seemed to have no link with the old man at all, he was able to write through my hand with great ease. He explained to me that he had been much devoted to the property, had lived only to improve it in every possible way, and that through his concentration of interest on this one subject, his life had been a very limited one, and that now he could not get away from the remembrance of his earth life and his beloved Greba. "I suppose he is trying to explain that he is earth-bound," suggested Mrs. Fitzherbert. "Yes, that is just the truth," was the eager response through my hand, "and it is so sad to think that my own descendants are the ones to keep me imprisoned in this way. I am told that I could progress, as they call it here, and be much happier if I could only forget Greba, even for a time. And it worries me to see things done so differently, and not to be able to do anything myself for the old place. There is no happiness for me here. Do ask them to set me free," he continued rather pathetically. "But they do not want to hold you down," I answered. "Tell me how they do it and what you wish them to do." The old man then explained the position very carefully and sensibly. He admitted that his own deep love for his old property and surroundings, and his failure in life to develop any other very deep affection, was chiefly in fault; but he added that his portrait being hung there in the hall of his descendants was also very unfortunate for him. It drags me down, I don't know why, but I am sure I could get away more easily if they would not keep that picture in the old hall." A few more practical questions elicited the following instructions. He said the picture might remain in the county so long as it was not in any house owned by a Lyon (there were several members of the family in Warwickshire), or it might be sent to London or elsewhere, and kept by members of the Lyon family so long as they were not in the direct descent and did not live in his old county. We drove over to Greba that afternoon and took the message with us, knowing there was no fear of encountering the gibes of my fox hunting friend at 3 p.m. on any weekday in the hunting season. Mrs. Lyon was extremely interested. She not only endorsed the Richard Lyon and his dates, but told us that he had done an immense deal for the property, as her husband had often impressed upon her, and that at his death, about 130 years before, he had lain in state for 3 days in the very hall where we had taken our tea, and where his picture now hung. This was great encouragement, so we put our heads together, wondering how the poor old man's entreaty might be complied with. Mrs. Lyon remembered that several of the old portraits were shortly to be sent to a picture dealer in the neighbouring town, some 10 miles away, to be cleaned, but this special picture was not in need of restoration, unfortunately. Still, I could put it with the others, and let it go to Warwick, and then tell the man not to do anything with it. But what would Edward say? Can you imagine his allowing the picture to be taken down upon this evidence? From an acquaintance with Edward extending over large tracts of years, I was forced to admit that even my robust imagination could not reach so far. "Skittles!" or "confounded cheek!" would be his mildest reply to such a request, even from a friend of his youth. I did not care to think how much further his indignation might carry him. But I felt so strongly that something outside myself had inspired the message, with its accurate instructions, that at last I prevailed upon Mrs. Lyon to promise she would mention the matter to her husband, and thus leave the responsibility of refusal with him. She did so, and the refusal was all my fancy had painted, and more. Several months passed, and the following spring I was once more in the neighbourhood, staying with my own relations this time, who were related also to the squire and his wife. The first piece of news I received at dinner the night of my arrival was that the Greba Hall picture had been sent in to Warwick. I could hardly believe my ears. My relatives could tell me nothing beyond the fact, and advised my paying an early visit to Greba Hall during the absence of the master. I did this, and Mrs. Lyon told me all she knew about the matter, which was not very much. "After you were here last," she said, "I spoke to Edward as I promised, and of course he laughed the whole thing to scorn, and was very rude about our tomfoolery." "Yes, I know all about that," I answered hastily, "but what happened afterwards, after I left Warwickshire, I mean?" "That was the queerest part of it all," she resumed. "A few days after you had gone away, he stood under the picture one evening, coming in from hunting and waiting for tea in the hall, and said, as he looked up at old Richard Lyon, 'Do you suppose I should allow your picture to be taken down, you who did so much for my property? Of course not.' This happened once or twice, at intervals. Then he said nothing, but I used to notice that he always looked up at the picture whenever he came into the hall or stood by the fireplace. At last, about 3 months ago, he turned round suddenly and said, 'When are you going to send those pictures to be cleaned?' Now you know I had been keeping the other pictures back, with a dim hope that Edward might relent, but I saw it was quite useless, so I told him they were going next day. To my intense surprise he said rather abruptly, 'Then send this picture with them, and don't ask me any questions.' His wife took the hint and waited for no second bidding. Off went the picture to the Warwick shop, and there it remained for nearly 6 months. When it came back eventually, the squire was very triumphant on the subject, but I was equally triumphant in pointing out that nothing could alter the fact that the picture had been sent away, in spite of his earlier denunciation of our folly. Also I suggested that a good deal can happen in 6 months on either side of the veil, and that no doubt poor old Richard Lyon had had ample opportunity to get free, as he called it, thanks to the unaccountable action of his descendant. I have reserved this story for my last chapter for two reasons. It happened within the last few years, but I cannot remember the exact date, and dare not inquire from my irascible hunting friend, and also it did not specially link on to any of the previous incidents described. I must now pass on to the autumn months of 1905, which found me in Eastbourne, where I have various kind friends. I had been going through a time of great anxiety, owing to family reasons, and went down to Eastbourne with every prospect of finding rest and peace there. I arrived on the 11th of November, and the first few days amply justified my hopes. Then a feeling of the most intense depression came over me, quite unexpected and unaccountable. My family anxieties and responsibilities were happily over. I had been able to make a wise and, as it turned out, most admirable choices in finding a fresh attendant for an invalid brother, and there was nothing now to be done but to rest on my oars and be thankful that a most trying time, requiring infinite patience and tact, was over. When this unaccountable depression came on so suddenly, I put it down to reaction, and expected it to pass away with returning strength after the heavy strain. But it increased as the weeks passed on into December, and did not lift until 8 a.m. on the morning of the 22nd of December. Then I had one of the most vivid experiences of my life. As suddenly as they had enveloped me some weeks before, so did the heavy clouds now roll off, leaving me with a sense of freedom and exaltation such as I have seldom experienced. This sense of freedom and joy and happiness was so marked that I mentioned it at once to an intimate friend who came to see me that day after breakfast. I said to her, "I can only describe it as if one had suddenly been let out of prison or taken from a dark, dismal room into one with glorious sunshine streaming through the windows, where the very sense of being alive is sufficient joy. In fact, I never felt so thoroughly alive before. And the curious thing is that there is no apparent reason for this. Nothing is changed. I have not even had any specially pleasant letters. Life is just the same on the outer, but on the inner, well, I cannot describe it." "But can't you account for it at all?" asked my friend, who had been with me through all the depressing influences of the former weeks, and was astounded, as well as delighted, by the inexplicable change in my spirits. "Well, it is the day after the shortest day," I said laughing, "but it has never had such an extraordinary effect upon me before." All day long this exuberant feeling of delight and happiness remained. I had no specially spiritual or religious experience in connection with it, but rather the happy feeling of confidence that a child might have who, after wandering about in unknown lands and thorny paths, suddenly found himself transported, with no effort of his own, to the dear familiar house and loving home faces. 5 days later, in a private letter, I read the first allusion to the death of Dr. Richard Hodgson. It came to me in a letter from Mrs. Forbes, not as a fact, but as an uncorroborated report, which would probably be found incorrect. There is nothing about it in the Times this morning, so I don't suppose it is true. These were her exact words. I don't think I ever really doubted the truth of it, although it came as a bolt out of the blue. Only a few days previously, a letter from an intimate friend of Dr. Hodgson in America, he had brought us together, mentioned her having seen him lately and thinking he was really much depressed over his work and other matters. Though doubtless if I taxed him with this he would say it was quite untrue, but I feel quite convinced that it is true. These words had not at the time given me any clue to my own curious depression, but when the first rumour of his death reached me, I felt convinced that it was true, and that I must have taken on his joyful conditions when he first found himself on the other side of the veil. I can only surmise, therefore, that the weeks of my depression may have corresponded with feelings alluded to by his intimate friend, although less intuitive, if not less valued associates, may have noticed nothing but his usual cheery and genial spirits. A telegram sent to Mr. Stead showed me clearly that my inquiry had been his first intimation of anything wrong. Then, in despair of getting accurate information, I wrote to Sir Oliver Lodge, who kindly responded at once, confirming my worst fears. He was good enough to send me later the particulars of the event supplied by Professor William James. It was a bitter blow for us, but for him how joyous an awakening! I am grateful for having had, through personal experience, even a dim reflection of that wonderful new life, so overwhelming and so exuberant that its rays could reach to the hearts of some of those who had been honoured by his friendship. On comparing notes I found that, allowing for difference of time, 48 hours must have elapsed between his physical departure and my experience of his awakening to new conditions. There may be various ways of accounting for this. The spirit may not have been wholly freed at once from its physical envelope, but may have remained possibly in some condition of unconsciousness after the strangely sudden severance of the tie that binds body and soul together. Note: since the above was written, I have received an explanation of the lapse of time between the passing of Dr. Hodgson, 20th of December, and my experience of 22nd of December, 1905. On the 6th of February, 1907, I had the privilege of a sitting with Miss Macready, who not only gave an accurate description of Dr. Hodgson's personal appearance and of his sudden call hence, but added that this spirit wished to explain to me that he had not been able to get entirely away from the body for quite 2 days after physical death, and that meanwhile he must have been in a state of trance. Miss Macready did not know the name of the spirit whom she described so accurately, and whose message was thus conveyed to me. Signed, E.K.B. End of note. Some time after Dr. Hodgson left us, a friend in London wrote to me that she had either just read or heard that he had made some communication to the effect that he was not very happy as he had regarded his work only from the intellectual point of view. This seemed to me a most unlikely sort of message to come from such a man. In such cases there is nothing like going to the fountainhead for information, and this came to me in the following words, which are, I think, characteristic and certainly sensible. My work was intellectual. How could I regard it from any other point of view? That has nothing to do with the spiritual side of things. My spiritual life was very latent, it is true, but it was sincere, so far as it went, and in this more favourable atmosphere the buds are unfolding, and I am learning more and more of the love and wisdom which I always dimly saw and appreciated. It is the attitude of mind which is all important, and my attitude, though critical, was never obstructive, as you know. I should like to say a few words now on the subject of superstitions. We are all superstitious in various ways and upon different points. I may laugh at your superstition because it does not happen to appeal to me, but you may be quite sure you could find out my Achilles heel if we lived together long enough. The only difference between people is that some are honest about their superstitions and others are not. I met a lady, not long ago, at a foreign table d'hôte, who started our acquaintance by remarking that she was thankful to say that she had not a single superstition. Before we had spent 10 days under the same roof, I discovered that she believed in portents and lucky stones, and the whole bag of tricks, and possessed the power of seeing people in their astral bodies. This is to introduce my own strongest superstition, which is a horror of seeing the new moon for the first time through glass. Breaking glass is almost as disastrous, in my experience, even if the article itself only costs a few pence. Now, I do not for one moment suggest that either one or the other is the cause of my subsequent misfortunes. No one surely can be childish enough to suppose such a thing. Yet I have known sensible people labour this point in order to show me the folly of my ways and thoughts. Again, I am quite aware that some people may break as much glass or china as the proverbial bull, and see the moon through the former medium every month of their lives, and not be a penny the worse for it, beyond the amount of their breakages. I only maintain that for me these two things are invariably the precursors of misfortune. When people say to me, "How can a sensible woman like yourself be so foolish as to think such things?" I can only truthfully answer that I should be very much more foolish if so many years of my life had passed without my noticing the sequence of events. But to explain the phenomena is quite another matter. It seems to me quite reasonable that, allowing the possibility of influences coming to us from the other side, some sign, no matter how trivial, might be impressed upon us as a gentle warning to be prepared for disasters more or less severe. Another curious thing is this. I have never found that avoiding seeing the moon through glass in any artificial way prevents disaster. I used to let kind friends, indulgent to my folly, lead me blindfold up to the window, carefully thrown open for my benefit. I can remember a most elaborate scene of precaution once in an American railway carriage between Philadelphia and Boston, when a charming American lady, about to lecture on women's suffrage, and grateful to me for some points I had given her with regard to the woman's question in New Zealand, insisted upon having a heavy window pulled up by a negro attendant when she found out my little weakness. It was all to no avail. Left alone, I should most certainly have seen the moon through glass on that occasion, and I felt, even at the moment, that I had not really altered anything by falling in with the kind American lady's suggestion. In September 1906 I was going through a course of baths at Buxton, and on a certain Sunday, 2nd of September, I saw the moon through glass in my bedroom window in the most unmistakable way. There was no friendly cloud, no other twinkling light to throw the smallest shadow of doubt upon the fact. There was much good-humoured laughter over my superstition in the house, but I knew some trouble was on its way, little dreaming that it was one which would alter my whole life. On the Wednesday morning, 5th of September, I received the first intimation of what proved to be the last illness of a brother who has been mentioned in these pages already, and who had been an invalid for nearly 30 years. A point to be noticed is that on the Sunday, when the sign came to me, he was in his usual health, and even on Monday went out for a long drive. The first attack of angina pectoris only came on in the middle of night on Monday to Tuesday, 3rd to 4th of September. Later, when the disease had become acute, and I was in the south of England, living in hourly suspense, and receiving telegrams and letters several times a day, another curious incident occurred which has a bearing upon our subject. As my readers are probably aware, in this sad and painful illness the only proof of unselfish affection which one can give may be to keep away from the patient when you know that all is being done for him that skill and devotion may suggest. The smallest agitation is almost certain to bring on a fresh attack of the terrible pain, and so long as there is any hope of a rally, or, in fact, any consciousness that can possibly result in increased suffering, everyone should be kept away from the patient except those who are in actual and necessary attendance. This naturally entails great mental distress and suffering upon those who are living from hour to hour in a state of tension and suspense. After more than a fortnight of alternate hopes and fears, the position became almost unendurable, and I was making all preparations for a visit to the patient, or at least to the house where he lay, against my better judgment, when letters and a telegram arrived imploring me not to come, as a short visit from another relative had proved most disastrous in bringing on another attack of the terrible pain, from which he never really rallied. Under these distressing circumstances there could be but one course open to me. I was staying with my kind friends, Admiral and Mrs. Osborne Moore, at this sad time, and can never feel sufficiently grateful for their goodness to me and sympathy with my distress. The Admiral, as many of us know, is a most persevering student of psychic science, and I think it was by his suggestion, or at any rate with his approval, that I determined to pay a visit to a lady of whom he had spoken to me, Mrs. Arnold, a daughter-in-law of Sir Edwin Arnold, who is a gifted clairvoyant. I went alone to the house, that she might not be able to connect me with my host and hostess, and the interview was a remarkable one. There were many evidential points given, which, for family reasons, it is impossible to publish. She gave me the crystal ball to hold for a good 5 minutes, in order that it might become impregnated by my influence, and then she took it from me and began making a series of statements, without pausing for a moment or attempting to fish, to use a technical term. These statements included my own life and studies and chief interests, and the number and sex of my immediate family, also the attitude of the various members towards myself, and in each case the special statement was absolutely correct. Her first words were: "You are in great anxiety, I see. It is about the illness of an elderly man. 2 people with whom you are in very intimate relations are ill, I see, but I will tell you now of the one you wish to hear about especially." She went on to describe not only my brother's surroundings and illness at the time, but also his permanent state of paralysis, adding that he was now in the country, for she saw green trees all round him and waving grass. As my brother's life for many years had been spent entirely between London and the seaside, this was a good bit of evidence. As a matter of fact, he was spending a few weeks in a country cottage for the first time in his life. The single point where she failed was as to the time of his passing away. She saw at once that the illness was one from which he could not permanently recover, and gave the approximate time very tentatively. We cannot see times exactly, they come only in symbols. For instance, I see now falling leaves, it looks like an autumn scene, and so I infer that means later on, perhaps October or November. This, as I have said, was the only mistake in the whole interview. My brother passed to the higher life on the 24th of September. When I saw his valet in town later, I asked him about the trees, and he explained that owing to the great heat the leaves were all over the ground and gave an autumnal look to everything. Most of us noticed the same appearance in London and elsewhere, even quite early in September 1906. The second friend lying dangerously ill was a puzzle to me at the time, but within 5 days of my brother's transition I heard of the death of Judge Forbes, who was one of my most intimate friends, as Mrs. Arnold had truly observed. His illness was a very short one, but on comparing notes with members of his family I found that he had taken to his bed 3 days before my visit to Mrs. Arnold, and was already seriously ill, although I had no knowledge of the fact for more than a week after my interview with her. Before closing these personal records, I must say a few words on the much vexed question of psychic photographs. As my friend Admiral Ashbourne Moore observes in a letter received from him as I write these words, we are dealing with a great mystery here. He is himself one of those who, by persevering efforts, is helping us to solve the mystery. It is certainly the branch of psychic science which promises the best results from an evidential point of view, but it must be a case of each man his own photographer. There is always a tendency in human nature to be over credulous as to our own achievements and over sceptical as to those of our neighbours. So for many years probably we shall only accept our very own psychic photographs as quite genuine, but when a sufficient number of people are convinced by their personal experiences in this line of research, there will be some hope that the subject will go through the usual stages: 1. Impossible and absurd. 2. Possible but very improbable. 3. Possible and not even abnormal. 4. Finally, normal and just what we knew all about from the first. Meanwhile, some of us have been experimenting with professional assistance, and in these cases the question is not, can such photographs be faked? We all know nowadays that faking photographs is the easiest of all possible frauds. I have spent many a half hour doing the faking myself with an amateur photographer by sitting for so many seconds in a chair and then vacating it in favour of some other spook. No, the whole question at present must be determined by our recognition or non-recognition of the photographs produced. If Mr. Bonsnell or any other photographer can produce, as he has done, my old nurse, who died 23 years ago and was never photographed in her life, then we must find some other suggestion than that of common or garden faking as a solution of the mystery. There she sits, as in life, with a little knitted shawl round her shoulders and the head of a tiny child upon her lap. The eyes are closed and give a dead look to the face, yet the features are to me quite unmistakable, and no one knew the dear old woman as well as I did. Again, I have in my little picture gallery an old and very well known Oxford professor, in whose house I stayed many times. Quite unexpectedly he appeared on one of Mr. Borsnell's plates last summer, and although this special photograph is fainter than the one just described, the likeness can only be denied by someone more anxious to be sceptical than truthful. I compared the photograph with an engraving of the Professor in much earlier life, which is to be found in the Life published since he passed away, with an artist friend who had not known him. We went over the features one by one, and my friend said she noticed only one small difference, the exact length of the upper lip, and this, she considered, would be amply accounted for by the lapse of time between the two pictures and the slight lengthening of the upper lip owing to loss of teeth. The Professor passed away as an old man. The picture engraved in the Life represents him as he was at least 20 years before his death. But the most interesting point to me in this photograph is the appearance on his lap of a much-loved dog, a rather large fox terrier named Bob. I had not noticed Bob until a daughter of the Professor pointed him out to me, and now I cannot understand having missed him at first. Bob was not only the most important person in the Oxford household, but he was good enough to be very fond of me, so it seems to me quite natural that he should have come with his master to pay me a visit. I remember arriving at the house one dark winter's evening after an absence of over 2 years, and Bob's welcome to me was so ecstatic that he nearly knocked me down in a vain attempt to get his paws round my neck. I heard the Professor, who was always rather jealous of Bob's affections, say in a whisper to his wife, "Most touching thing I ever saw, that dog's welcome when Miss Bates arrived. Dear Bob, I'm so glad he can still come and see me with his dearly loved master." Another shuffle of the photographs brings to the top a sweet girlish face and figure 16 summers or something less. She appeared first upon a plate in the summer of 1905, but so indistinctly as to the face that I could not recognize it. A few months ago the same figure appeared again, but quite clearly this time, and involuntarily, as I looked at it, I exclaimed, "Why, of course, it is Lily Blake!" Now it is nearly 30 years since I met this charming child, during my first visit to Egypt. She and her father, a well-known physician, and her aunt were spending a 6 weeks' holiday in Cairo, and I saw more of her than would otherwise have been the case, because she was the playmate of another young girl, the child of friends of mine at Shepherd's Hotel. Lily was a sweet-looking, delicate girl, with soft, sleepy blue eyes, and was always dressed in a simple, artistic fashion. A few months after our return to England, I saw in the papers the death of this pretty child, for she was little more at the time. I wrote a letter of condolence and sympathy, which was at once answered by the aunt in very kind fashion, and since then I had seen nothing to remind me of Lily until this last year has brought her once more within my ken. I am only too thankful to realise that any influence so pure and beautiful as hers may be around me sometimes in my daily life. And now let me say, in the words of our great novelist, "Come, children, let us shut up the box and the puppets, for our play is played out." Only, I trust, in this case we have managed to rise a little above the usual atmosphere of Vanity Fair. Surely the aim of all psychic research should be to give us a scientific, as we have already, thank God, a spiritual, foundation for the hope that is in us. Spirit photographs and spirit materializations and abnormal visions or abnormal sounds amount to very little if we look upon them as an end in themselves, and not as the symbols and the earnest of those greater things which "eye hath not seen nor ear heard, neither hath it entered into the heart of man to conceive." I remember, years ago, in the course of a deeply interesting conversation with Phillips Brooks, the late Bishop of Massachusetts, that I asked him what he thought about modern theosophy, which was just then becoming a cult in his native town of Boston. There was a great deal of talk at the time about the new philosophy and the wonderful phenomena said to accompany its propaganda. Sir Edwin Arnold had written his Light of Asia, and Oliver Wendell Holmes had welcomed it with wondering awe as something approaching a new revelation. And smaller people were talking about the historical Blavatsky teacups and hidden heirlooms found in Indian gardens, and some of us were wondering how soon we should learn to fly and what would come next. The bishop's answer to my question was so genial, so characteristic, and showed such divine common sense. "It is not a question of flying," he said. "I should like to fly as much as anybody, and a queer sort of bird I should appear." He was well over 6 feet and broad in proportion. "If you suddenly found you could fly," he continued, "it would be absorbing on Monday morning, intensely interesting on Tuesday, interesting on Wednesday, and quite pleasant on Thursday. But by the end of the week it would be getting normal, and you would want to discover some other new power. No, believe me, the real question is not flying, but where you would fly and what you would do when you got there." This sums up the case in a nutshell, and seems to me only another way of saying, don't forget the spiritual significance beneath the scientific symbol. And I would add, let us all join hands in the interesting and absorbing work of trying to make our symbols as scientific as we can, by finding out the laws which govern them, as well as all other things in this universe of love and law. Probably we are here to learn, above all things else, that love and law are one. Many people have had far more remarkable experiences than mine. For various good reasons I have carefully abstained from any attempt to cultivate or in any way increase the sensitiveness which is natural to me. I can only assure my readers that my record has been absolutely accurate. In many cases it would have been very easy to write up the stories into some far more dramatic form, but by doing so the whole aim and object of my book would have been destroyed. I wanted to trace the thread of what we at present consider abnormal through the whole skein of a single life, hoping thereby to encourage others to do the same. It is only by putting these things down, if not for publication, then in some diary or commonplace book, that we can realize how far our normal life is, even now and here, interpenetrated by another plane of existence. And so, farewell to all kind readers who have followed me to the end of my personal record of curious events, curious chiefly by reason of our present imperfect knowledge. End of section 17.
Section 18 of Seen and Unseen. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Seen and Unseen by E. Katharine Bates. Appendix 1. Much has been said of the folly and triviality of all messages coming, or purporting to come, from the unseen. I think here, as elsewhere, like claims to like, and we get very much what we deserve. Or rather, to put it in a more philosophical and Emersonian way, we receive what belongs to us. Emerson tells us in one of his most illuminating passages that everything which belongs to our spiritual estate is coming to us as quickly as it can travel. All the winds of heaven, all the waves of earth are bringing it to us, and neither angel nor devil can prevent our taking what is ours or rejecting what is not ours. This is a universal law, and applies to automatic writing as to everything else. Emphatically, we get what belongs to our spiritual estate. Therefore, any casual and general remarks as to the foolishness of all automatic writing must of necessity be made by those who are ignorant of this spiritual law, or whose experience of such messages is very limited. I intend to give a few which I have myself received in the form of an appendix to my book. With one exception, they all come from a very dear friend, who passed into the other sphere little more than a year ago, under peculiarly happy circumstances. I do not wish to give his name, although it would add considerably to the interest of the narrative. I shall therefore call him Mr. Harry Denton. The messages will be given exactly in the form in which they were received, and without any editing. We never discussed theological ideas from any standpoint of creed, but I imagine that my friend, when here, would have looked upon Jesus Christ as one of the many inspired teachers of the world, and that his views were cosmic rather than religious in any narrow sense, and certainly religious in the broad sense of the term, rather than theological. The first conversation, for this is a better description of my friend's communications than the word message, refers to my own attitude as compared with that of a lady friend of mine regarding Jesus of Nazareth. H.D. I see a great stream of light round you, Kate, and it seems to have come with your truer conception of Jesus Christ. It is all right for your friend to say she prefers to put the matter aside and leave it alone. That is just the best thing she can do, in fact the only thing she can do at present. The seed is still underground, and the moment of emergence has not come. To try and force it above ground just now would be fatal. It would also be immature and uncalled for. The old husks of man-made creeds must drop off gradually, leaving the bud they protected intact, not be torn off by an impatient hand. So far her instinct seems to me a true one, but the case is widely different for you. The husks have fallen off, as a matter of fact, and the discomfort and sense of something wrong arose from your knowing that you were only striving desperately to clutch on to them when the fine, strong bud was there, able and ready to take its proper share of sunshine and rain, and even to bear the cold winds of misrepresentation and misunderstanding if need be. Quit you like men. Be strong. That is your lesson book, and you will never feel happy or content until you are learning it. Surely you must feel how much you have gained since you faced your own facts. E.K.B. Yes, Harry, I do, but I don't quite understand your position. Are you at the same point of view? H.D. No, not yet. It is all rather foreign to my previous notions. I thought of Jesus of Nazareth as a great teacher, one of the great teachers of the world, but I had still to learn his unique position as regards our chain of worlds. They tell me here that he was the first to attain the full stature of the divine man, as he existed in the thought of the Absolute. Spiritual evolution is the process, apparently the only process, whereby a Son of God, in this sense, can appear, and the bonds of time have been necessary to produce this fine flower of humanity. Your own band are helping me to understand this. Having attained, being the anointed one, it is given to him to bring the whole race after him. This is quite a different conception from my former one, and the one held by most of those whom in the old days we called Unitarians. You have had to unlearn, or rather to drop, some of the husks of old tradition which have been guarding the truth for you, whereas I have still to come up to the truth. But the point reached will be the same, whether the approach to it is from the north or south. Do you see? In Christ Jesus, they tell me, we are all new creatures. As a matter of fact, because consciously or unconsciously, we are working together with him to realize and manifest ourselves as made after the image of God. He is the example and the pledge for us. St. Paul saw this, of course, and your present position illuminates his teaching for me enormously. So I have much to thank you for, Kate. It is easier to learn from those we know and trust than from strangers. And moreover, when we can learn from the loved ones on earth, as well as through the loved ones here, it makes the links in the golden chain complete, and helps us to realize the unity and solidarity of our common existence, in the Father, with the Son. H.D. 2. Another morning I had told H.D. that I had been reading an article in the 19th Century and After, I think entitled An Agnostic's Progress, and asked if he had sensed it through me at all. H.D. Yes, we will begin with that this morning. I am very glad you read it, for it is curiously like my own experiences in the same line. Since coming over here, and thereby coming into such direct touch with you, I have been able to grasp the key to much that puzzled me on the other side. As my views became more spiritualized, I saw there must be more truth in the Christian religion than outsiders supposed, and yet I knew it could not be absolutely true in the form in which it has been handed down. That, for me, was unthinkable, because I saw it would be a sudden and catastrophic incursion upon a cosmos of law and order. It would mean God working in the highest departments of his creation, as he is never seen to work in the lower ones, and my faith in him prevented my entertaining such an idea. Schemes and plans of salvation belong to the comparative childhood of the race, not to the full-grown spiritual man. They are still in the fairy tale stage, holding a truth, but acting only as the husk of the truth. The unity of the race, the necessity for self-sacrifice in realizing that unity, that by giving our life for our brothers we save our life, which is that unity in which the brethren are included, all this I could accept in Christ's teaching or the teaching of the apostles. But the rest, the detail, the carefully arranged scheme of the atonement, etc., as dogmatic doctrines, all these seem to me so obviously the desperate attempts of man at a certain stage of development to fit in the spiritual facts with the most probable theories, and to say that men who wrote of these things were inspired and therefore infallible was absurd. Even in my short life, I had seen the world pass through several stages of belief and assimilate them in turn. As a child, I was told that God was angry with people for sinning and breaking his commandments, and so Jesus Christ offered to come and die on the cross to appease his just wrath. That seemed a great puzzle to me because, although it might account for what happened before Christ came and until he came, I could not understand why God should go on letting people come into the world who would break his laws and make him still more angry for centuries and centuries. That seemed to me, as a child, so unnecessary. Later I was told it was not God's anger but his sense of justice that had to be appeased and satisfied, which was a distinct step in advance. A little later, however, I read that this was not the hidden truth of the doctrine. The religious world, the thoughtful section of it, now arrived at the idea that it was not God who needed to be satisfied or appeased in any of his attributes, but man, and that God, in the person of his Son, came into the world to reconcile the world to him, and not himself to the world. This was a complete bouleversement of the whole situation, though it came so gradually that few appreciated that fact. The last suggestion appeared to me by far the most luminous. In human life it is invariably the lower nature that needs to be reconciled and conciliated, whilst the higher nature, in proportion to its development, is forgiving and tolerant and wide-minded, and does not prate about its own high sense of justice requiring to be appeased. The best type of man punishes a wrongdoer in order that he may learn to do better and leave off tormenting and wronging his fellow creatures, not to appease any instinct in his own breast, for that would be egotism, no matter how we might try to disguise the fact. Now it would be a blot upon the best conceivable man to be egotistical. A fortiori must it be upon God. To conceive otherwise is to make God in the likeness of the lower and not the higher humanity. I thought all that out very clearly. Still this crux remained for me, that to be suddenly, at any arbitrary moment in the world's history, obliged, as it were, to send an absolutely divine part of himself into the world, was the way a man would act faced by an unforeseen catastrophe, but not the way in which God has acted throughout the rest of our history. A succession of teachers, enlightening the world by degrees, and culminating in the anointed Son of God, the flower of humanity, this is entirely in line with the processes of nature and the laws of God, so far as we know them. All progress has its culminating point. The eons have passed to produce the most exquisite crystals, the highest forms of vegetation, of animals, of men. Then came the slow processes of civilizing and educating men, the dim instincts of fear and propitiation, merging, by slow degrees, in the first conceptions of love, as something apart from desire, and so forth. Was I to be expected to shut my eyes to all these known facts and bolt down the theories contained in one book written by human authors, no matter how admirable? I felt it was impossible. Then I remembered with relief that these very dogmas, as a matter of fact, were in so fluent a state that my own bare 50 years of living had seen at least 4 different high water marks. Here again, therefore, under my very eyes, was the universal law of progress working, the moment it could work, by being released from the swaddling clothes of the Roman Catholic Church, which, so far as it is orthodox, is fossilized. I saw also that the whole body of dissent had moved on, taking up its pegs and planting them a little further on each time, till a city temple, with its widening theology, was an established fact. Progress everywhere, slow but sure, and the pace getting quicker, even in my short span. Still, the uniqueness of Jesus of Nazareth and his influence over the 19 centuries was a puzzle. Buddha's influence has lasted longer, Muhammad's almost as long. The two cancel anyway. But I have always recognized an advance in the teaching of Jesus Christ. He brought a fresh element in the personal note of the sonship with God. I was at this point when I came over here. Now through your mind I have been able to see, and, oddly enough, to quicken in your soul the seed already planted there. They tell me the illumination came to you years ago, at Oberammergau. No, not when you were there for the Passion Play, 4 years earlier. You took it in with your head then, not with your heart. Old traditions were too strong, I suppose, and you had not made up the last little bit of your mind to be true to the convictions that had come to you through your prayers for light. And so you have gone on, seesawing to and fro, not really believing the old orthodox ideas, but not courageously sweeping them away for yourself. So although the key was in your hands, you have not used it until now. You have given me the key, and I have been allowed, as my New Year's gift, to fit it in the door. This is how Jesus Christ has stood so long at the door of your heart and knocked. He could only enter through the one door, namely, that one opened in the highest point of your spiritual realization. I see now that he comes in at that door in each soul, and as spiritual evolution unfolds in each heart, so is the special position of that door shifted. But the fact of his presence is the vital one. It was not possible for him to do otherwise than hide his face, as it were, whilst you were barring his only door of access, that is, your true point of realization. It all seems so clear to me now, and this is how he comes to so many in different guises. He is the perfected manifestation of God, as the divine man, the flower of humanity. But he can come into the heart in the narrowest creed, so long as the holder of that creed is at his true point of growth, and not trying to stifle God's gift of ever-advancing truth by cowardly want of trust, or fear of being worse off in the end by being absolutely honest to himself and his own convictions in the present. It has been a long message, and you have taken much of it awkwardly, but on the whole it represents what I wanted to say. H.D. 3. H.D. I feel now that you want to know what I meant by telling Miss R. it was the likeness to the old world which puzzled me here. You see, we have all imbibed traditional ideas with our mother's milk, however much our intellects may have modified them. Instinct is stronger than intellect because it is more elemental. The first thing that struck me was that truths which are latent on earth are made manifest here. Here comes an interpolation. You can take my words so easily that we must guard against wasting time in mere verbosity. I must teach you to condense more. We must strike some sort of balance between my brevity and your amplification. At present it is as well to get the instrument into proper working order before worrying too much over these details. He then resumed. It is as if you turned the old earth garment inside out, and saw the very fabric of it, which the earth looms have hitherto concealed by the warp and woof of the manufactured article. For instance, you are told on earth that you are making your own future conditions by right or wrong thinking. Here, You see the absolute material results of right and wrong thinking, just as if you were looking at two different patterns woven by two different workers. I said material results because matter here is just as real as it was on Earth, and just as illusory. In one sense, in both spheres, your matter is unreal to us. Our matter is unreal to you. The truth is, both are shadows cast by an antecedent reality on the screens of the universe. The screens are the schoolhouses through which humanity learns its lessons. Don't be worried. There is no real difficulty in using your hand. It is only trying to compromise between your redundancy and my brevity. Earth is like a gallery of sculpture. Note by E.K.B. This simile had flashed through my brain, and H.D. at once said, "Yes, that is very good. You started it, and I pick it up and apply it." All the figures and groups are perfected and complete in their marble, or bronze, or terracotta, as the case may be. Some groups or figures are noble, others mediocre, others again may be sensual and degrading, but they have one quality in common. For good or bad, they are ready-made. Now go into the sculptor's studio. Having studied well in the great sculpture galleries of the world, you go to the studio, we will suppose, as a pupil. He puts a lump of clay into your hands, and for the first time you are invited to model your own statues and figures, to embody your own ideas in this clay, which corresponds to thought stuff here. You are even made to understand that your houses will only be worthily furnished by the work of your own hands. Here it is the work of your own hearts, of your loving or unloving thoughts. So the first lesson we learn over here is that thought is not only creative power, as you are often told on earth, but it is also the very stuff out of which the creation must be molded. It is, in very truth, the clay of the modeler. Shakespeare said truly enough, "We are such stuff as dreams are made of," but he was referring to our embodied selves. The difference between the two worlds seems to me, so far as I have arrived, as the difference between the pupil in the sculpture gallery and in the experimental studio. The chief part of the earth modeling is ready-made, made by the racial thought stuff and the racial manipulation of it. Here, for the first time, we must turn to and take a hand in the work ourselves. It would not be possible to give such individual power in any lower sphere than this, for it would be misused and would lead to terrible tragedies. You see some slight hints of this in what is called black magic, the willful and intentional throwing of evil conditions on other people, making hard and cruel images of them in the mind, and so forth. But all that is as child's play to what would happen if the absolute clay were put into their hands, as it is here. It is the difference between thinking out an ugly picture and painting it and hanging it up in a gallery. For we have objectivity here as with you. Naturally, what comes into objective existence has more power than what remains latent. The latter can only influence exceptionally sensitive souls, and that to a comparatively small extent, whereas the former, here as with you, has a much farther range of influence. So this sort of gunpowder is not given to us until we are old enough to know better than to burn our fingers with it in trying to make fireworks. At the same time, as all stages of evolution overlap, it is inevitable that some hint of these possibilities should be already in your world. Woe be to those who misuse them. You have taken enough for this morning. H.D. 4. The friend I have called Mr. Harry Denton, during his psychic researches, came, as many others have done, very strongly under the influence of Imperator, the chief of the Stainton Moses controls. I knew that this was the case, especially during the last 3 or 4 years of my friend's life, and I always rather resented the fact, for the limitations of Imperator have always appealed to me so strongly as to dim, perhaps unduly, his undoubted claims to appreciation. I have read many of the private Stainton Moses's records, thanks to my friendship with the executor with whom these journals were left, and in all those referring to Imperator's communications, there was, to my mind, the same note of cocksureness and mental tyranny. There was too much of finality and self-assertion, too much of "Thus saith the Lord," about Imperator's remarks for my rebellious soul. I could never be strongly impressed by any personality, however admirable, that so palpably exacted allegiance and unquestioning obedience. These must be the unconscious tribute to the genius of holiness, as to any other sort of genius, never an enforced levy upon us. So at least it seems to me. Certainly I would not escape one sort of priestcraft to set up another in its place, whether the niche be filled by Mrs. Besant, or Mrs. Eddy, or Mr. Sinnett, or any other fallible fellow creature. Not even Imperator can strike me as infallible, and his own evident belief in that direction does not affect the question. It seemed to me rather to be deplored that Mr. Denton, with his wide outlook and cosmic conceptions, should fall so strongly under any special influence, even that of the admirable Imperator. So I was curious to know what his views were upon this subject from the other side of the veil. I will now leave him to speak for himself. H.D., you want me to tell you just my position about the Imperator group before and since I passed to this side? That is easily done. Remember, the teaching I got through Imperator was practically the first spiritual teaching I ever had. The first, I mean, of course, that I could assimilate, because it appealed to my reason as well as to my sense of the fitness of things, and therefore I can never feel sufficiently grateful to him and his group, and I see that they can teach many who would not be amenable to a more distinctly spiritual appeal. Imperator is a great force in his way, a sort of plough that goes over the hard, caked-up earth and throws it open to the sunshine and rain and all nature's beautiful influences, to all the possibility of divine influences on the corresponding sphere. But the limitation of Imperator I see clearly now, as you always appear to have done. He is, as you say, too final and too dogmatic. This is at once his weakness and his strength. His weakness because it limits his own spiritual receptivity, his strength because it focuses his power in dealing with materialistic minds. A more spiritually true perspective in his communications would rule out half the souls to whom his appeal is made. Stainton Moses has also progressed beyond the Imperator influence, and this is why the communications between them had become so clogged and so liable to error. S.M. could not switch on to the old wires, as in the days when his horizon was bounded by them. This accounts, I see, for much of the misconception and apparent inconsistency of the remarks made through Mrs. Piper, but it was very disheartening for the investigator as time went on and the light became more and more clouded. Then there was the additional fact to be faced that Mrs. Piper herself became, psychically rather than physically, exhausted and less able to be used from this side. Now I see you want to know about Frank Strong and what he said about sin existing only on your plane, and how inconsistent this was with the previous teachings of Stainton Moses, who was supposed to be speaking through Frank's assistants. It is so difficult to explain everything in black and white when there are so many shades of gray, so many degrees and amounts to be considered. It is like a question in mechanics. With increased momentum you get an increased rate as multiplied by space. I am not an expert, but this is practically true. In the same way, spiritual perception acts with increased momentum. All sin is failure in spiritual perception. Spiritual perception corresponds with the momentum of a falling body in mechanics. Only in divine mechanics is it a rising body, but the same law holds good. You say truly that an action can only be called sinful when the sinner knows the higher and deliberately turns to the lower. That is true, but it is only half a truth. It is still the lack of knowledge that causes sin. with the fullness of knowledge of the higher. Only another way of putting fullness of spiritual perception must come the righteousness of life. It is the broken gleams, the little knowledge, which is truly a dangerous thing, for it brings responsibility and therefore the capacity for sinning. Yet the choice between good and evil fully made is the schoolmaster to bring us to the full realization of our nature as sons of God. Now, when Frank came over here, he was so greatly impressed by the dynamic force of spiritual perception that for the time he lost all sense of proportion and accuracy of judgment. Compared with the old earth temptations, those in his sphere seemed non-existent, whilst the temptations to goodness were enormously increased. What wonder that in the delightful sensation caused by his sense of moral and spiritual freedom from old shackles, he should exclaim with youthful fervor, "Sin is only possible in your sphere. It is unknown here." Any communications of which he formed the channel would of necessity be colored by this dominant idea of his. Everything is a question of degree, and he is learning that lesson now, I find. He says, "Why do people in the earth life quote our words as if we were Delphic oracles? Why indeed? But I am afraid I did much the same whilst so strongly under the Imperator influence." E.K.B. Why is Imperator so slow in throwing off his own spiritual limitations? H.D. I can read your mind so easily. It is quick and alert, and has already answered its own question. It is because he has a work to do on your plane amongst those who cannot come in touch with a higher spiritual development. There are spiritual as well as scientific martyrs, you must remember, and he is one of them. But the divine economy works very beautifully here. He is not conscious of any spiritual limitation, and therefore he is happy in his work. And the martyrdom I spoke of is unconscious. When it becomes conscious, with him it will mean that his present plane of work is finished, and that he will be removed to another form, so soon as he is prepared to teach there. He is essentially a teacher, and a valuable one, for those who have not soared beyond his present perceptions. It is all so much more simple and reasonable than you suppose. It is these crusted old creeds that have misrepresented actual conditions, and yet they also have been, as Imperator, doing their own work amongst the people to whom they have acted as necessary stepping stones. That is enough for today. Take a rest now. H.D. 5. The following conversation between Mr. Denton and myself, the last of the series which I propose to give, took place, I see, at Buxton, 4th September 1906. There had been some correspondence in the Daily Telegraph about time as a fourth dimension, and I asked my friend if he could say anything to me on the subject. His reply was as follows. Time is really a form of perception, not a thing in itself. Do you understand? Your limitation of perception you call time. Another limitation is called distance. This is also an illusion, or a limitation, whichever you choose to call it. The white ray is the absolute. The spectroscope gives you the limitation which makes the colors perceptible to your human eyes. For the one who is free from these limitations, all colors exist and are present in consciousness at the same moment, but they must be split up and observed severally to enter into the earth consciousness. It is exactly the parallel of time. Events in time coincide with the colors in the ray. All exist simultaneously for the one who is free from limitations. All must be brought into sequence for the one who is bound by limitations. This is really the key to so many puzzles, and accounts for so many occult phenomena. As we transcend the normal earth limits ever so little, so do we develop these abnormal powers, as they are called. But here, as everywhere, the reality is just the converse of the apparent. The true norm is the perfect ray, the ceaseless sound, the perfect vision, and the abnormal is the limitation upon the earth, or upon any succeeding plane short of the absolute. But naturally we consider that normal which happens to be our standpoint for the moment. Already to me the earth limitations appear abnormal, and my more extended capacities mark the norm of existence for me. This must be the case naturally. Prevision would be more accurately termed whole vision, seeing the whole and not the tiny section. In moments of intense joy or realization of any kind, time seems to cease, and a moment may hold an eternity. Any absorbing emotion, joyful or sorrowful, may bring this experience. For the moment, you are out of yourselves. This is literally true. You are living in the next dimension. Time and space no longer exist for you. Most of you have had some such experience, but of necessity it can be a flash only in the midst of your normal life. Ask me something now. EKB. A man writing lately in the Daily Telegraph of time as a fourth dimension said something about the cube as being an infinite number of flat planes of infinite tenuity, heaped up one over the other. To the person who knew only length and breadth, the cube would have no existence. Such a person would realize only an infinite number of planes in sequence, yet they would all coexist for the three-dimensional man of the present day. The suggestion appeared to be that, in exactly a similar way, events which to the three-dimensional man can only be perceived normally in sequence would coexist for a four-dimensional being. This would mean practically the annihilation of time as giving sequence. Do you see truth in this idea? And can you tell me if it extends also to space? HD. Certainly. That is just what I meant as regards distance. All limitations are mental, as a matter of fact. We have them here, but infinitely fewer than in the old earth life. Mind has always been able to flash from pole to pole and to affect those at a distance, because mind and distance occupy two different planes. The latter is an earth limitation. As the veil lifts a little, even on your side, so you become conscious that mind has these powers. But the powers were always there. It merely means that you have come up with your own mental capacities to some small degree. EKB. Is there any help here for my constant problem? Why should one's individual life be only now, evolving in eternity? Do you see what I mean? HD. Yes, but I hardly know the answer to that tremendous problem. Still, I will try to suggest a few thoughts to you. To be conscious of holiness and virtue, we must have known its antithesis, evil and separation, which are really synonymous. Separation from holiness is evil. It is a condition, a limitation. It is to the divine essence just such a limitation as time is to the mortal. Separation is therefore the antecedent cause of all limitations. These must exist where the wholeness or holiness is absent. I must use the language of earth, or you would not understand. Logically, of course, holiness can never be absent, since it is the cause of all existence. But it is apparently absent, and this apparent absence, this separation, this evil, in fact, acts as a spectroscope. It analyzes and thus brings into our consciousness the white ray of the divine nature. We can go no further than that. The divine chemistry, beyond this fact, must remain a mystery, probably for ages to come. We cannot tell why things are thus arranged. We only know that it is so. As well ask why. The white ray of light gives out its colors only through separating them. But it is easier to speak of the coordination of events. Take your own suggestion of the cube. That will help us best. Take it that each life is a cube of planes, of experiences. These experiences are coexistent and knit together, as firmly in the life of a human being as the many planes are coexisting and knit together in a mathematical cube. You can dissect the cube and slice off infinitesimal small planes in sections. So is the individual life sliced off into an infinite number of planes by the sequences of time, our three-dimensional condition. But these experiences, great or small, important or trivial, from your point of view, exist in the cube of that person's earth pilgrimage, as the colors exist in the white ray. The ray may be split up into sequence, but the colors belong to it all the same, and by a perfectly seeing eye would be known and recognized without the help of the spectroscope. The true seer is the one who sees the cube of your life, before whom it is spread out, without time separations, into planes of experience. This is the real secret of all foretelling. Such people, when honest, have some amount of access to the cube of earth life, some more, some less. Many mix up and confuse what they see, but they do see beyond the plain section which time gives to the normal human being. I think you have taken enough now. I will only add that, of course, as you know, there is nothing arbitrary in the cube of life, as I have called it. It is built up of necessary experiences and necessary consequences, but it is built up by love and wisdom, the two elements of the divine nature, in which we live and move and have our being. H.D. 6. The next selection that I shall give from my automatic script comes from an entirely different personality, which can be sufficiently indicated by the initials E.G. E.g. Worship is a necessary part of each soul's training, and we can only worship that which we feel to be above and beyond ourselves. As we grow older and become more developed in spiritual consciousness, so do we tend more and more to worship the inner and intangible, rather than the outer and manifest. So whilst the instinct of worship is always the same, the objects and methods must continually change with our own advancing realization and unfolding consciousness. Those limitations which once made for reverence are in time found to be cramping and to lead to superstition. It is the same with the education of either children or of childish nations. In both cases a display of power is necessary to command obedience, because the childish mind can only apprehend from the outer and realize the existence of that which it sees physically demonstrated. Tell a child of tender years that to be naughty is to be unhappy, and in 99 cases out of 100 he will neither understand nor believe you. But take away his toys or his sweets, or put him in a corner, make him, in fact, physically aware of the truth that to be naughty is to bring unpleasant consequences upon himself, and you have taken the only argument which he is capable of realizing at a certain point of consciousness. That is why certain nations, at the child point of development, must be treated as children. They don't realize the appeal to the spiritual, and will only misconceive you and your motives, and read cowardice in your attempt to treat them from a standpoint that they have not reached. It is the same with certain religions, and this is the cause of much failure in mission work. Theosophy and Roman Catholicism appeal strongly to comparatively immature minds, those who care more for form than for essence and are always in the immature stage. They love big words and mysterious sayings and doings. To have something apart from others, whether it be happiness or knowledge, is their idea of bliss. Hence, in most theosophists, as in all Roman Catholic converts, you find this note of immaturity and monopoly. I say converts, because those born in the Roman Catholic faith are on different ground. Their spiritual life may grow and develop in spite of the creed limitations into which fate has cast them. But those who deliberately choose such limitations give the best possible proof of their own standpoint. And the same may be said also of all strict creed religions. They have their great and valuable uses, as prison bars have their uses in a community which has not learnt to respect the rights and property of its neighbors, Withdraw these bars and you let loose upon society a pestilential crew of murderers and marauders. Relax the bars of creed and you will find the same result. But as bars are not necessary for the advanced souls who recognize that to murder or defraud their fellow creatures leads to their own misery, apart from any detection or punishment, so creeds are not necessary, under a corresponding evolution of the spiritual instinct, which tallies with the social and moral instincts noted above. And as treadmills and oakum picking can be dismissed in the one case, so can much of the theological machinery for the discipline and punishment of sinners against spiritual laws be dispensed with, in the case of those who are, spiritually speaking, coming of age. They come then into the full liberty of sons of God, and shall be no more treated as servants, but as sons, as the Apostle puts it. This brings me to my special subject. There are many things of great and transcending interest which we are obliged to keep secret from our younger children, partly because they would fail to understand, but still more because they would misunderstand, and this to their own hurt and disadvantage, not to speak of possible injury to others through them. Spiritual evolution is the true doctrine, but it is not food for babes in spiritual life. To have an unlimited series of advancing lives and advancing experiences unfolded before their eyes would not only dismay and bewilder, but would also paralyze their energy for good and terribly augment their capacity for evil, for the not good. Until they are sufficiently versed in spiritual experience to realize the difference between purity and impurity, good and evil, God and the world, fame and peace, pleasure and happiness, the peace which passes understanding in the false glamour of sensual passion and sensuous self-indulgence, so long it is dangerous for them to know, with absolute certainty, the real facts of the case. Even the terrible and abhorrent pictures of an eternal hell, of endless flames and of undying worms, have had their uses. In this form alone could the thoroughly immature mind be made to realize the discomfort and misery that would inevitably attend wrong-doing. It was a truth, although not a literal truth. Many literal truths convey a false impression to the immature mind, whilst a symbolic truth may convey as true an impression as such a mind is capable of receiving. The old ideas of heaven and hell are already doomed, but other ideas, equally untrue from the literal point of view, still hold their own, and will be more slowly eradicated. It is well this should be so. The world at large is not prepared yet to take this further step. Frequent examinations have been found useful and inevitable in school training, both as a test of progress and still more as an encouragement. If you tell a school of boys and girls in January that a grand examination will be held the following December, do you suppose they will work as well and as diligently as if they knew there will be short examinations at Easter and more important ones at midsummer? Again, if you tell boys of 10 years old, who are learning a little history, geography, and arithmetic just in the rule of 3 and simple fractions, with perhaps a little Latin, of the algebra and Euclid and conic sections of higher mathematics, and Latin and Greek verse and Hebrew and philosophy, which they must some day confront, you will puzzle and paralyze their brains, and leave only a sense of misery and revolt and helplessness, which will quickly show forth in reckless despair, even concerning the tasks which are well within their present capacity. God, in His infinite wisdom, of which ours is the feeblest reflection, acts in precisely the same way as wise fathers and wise teachers. Your earth is more or less of an infant school, but before leaving it, some of you must prepare for the higher classes and learn to take your own spiritual responsibilities. It is seen that in these days of reaction and readjustment, many minds are puzzled and perplexed by the old doctrines, which they have outgrown, and which were never more than the outer husk and protection for the inner kernel, the casket for the jewel of spiritual truth. The one term of probation, the one chance for progress, the immediate heaven or hell, the great white throne of judgment, instant and inevitable, all these correspond with the frequent examinations, with the good and bad marks, the judging of the schoolwork at the end of each term. The only difference lies in the fact that the schoolboy knows he has other terms in front of him, and we are all aware that this is a very unfortunate fact where an idle boy is concerned. How often you may hear them say, "Never mind, I'm a bit behind now, but I have 3 years more. I shall catch up later." And this is probably just what they fail to do, for with such characters it is always tomorrow. That is to see the reformation which so often comes only when life has taught its hard lessons to the defaulter. Is it not apparent, therefore, that there has been wisdom and goodness in our very theological mistakes and illusions? The opposition to spiritualistic teachings has its good and healthy side. It is really the fierce antagonism of the undeveloped nature towards a truth it dimly apprehends to be ahead of its own development, and, tiresome as it seems, and is, from one point of view, it is the best safeguard for the world at large. Unimaginable horrors would come to pass upon the earth were power, as well as knowledge, put into the hands of the crude and undeveloped. It would be arming savages with Winchester rifles and quick-firing guns. Never regret, therefore, this opposition, even whilst fighting against it in individual cases. Both must grow together till the harvest, the tares and wheat, the crude and the developed, and the former are the enormous majority. This is the reason why all truth must be born into each world through a fight and an agony, for it always comes as an advance upon normal conditions, no matter in which sphere it may be, and it is through the struggle that the victory comes and the light is born. Let people jeer and deride when they hear of a future life, not so very different from your own, of houses and lectures and boats and horses, of pet animals, and so forth. Those who jeer and deride or talk of blasphemy are still at the orthodox stage, when it is well for them to know only of one school, of one term, of one chance, and of an immediate and final judgment for the deeds done on earth. Others are old enough, spiritually speaking, to know the truth, that is, that God is in all of an infinite series of spheres through which each traveling soul must pass, gaining ever fresh light, growing ever into fresh knowledge and realization of divine beauty and divine love. Spheres differing little externally from the one left behind, but enormously in the capacities and qualities which, by degrees, the soul will unfold in the cosmic journey. The outer will become more and more the result of the inner condition, for the creative faculty, scarcely born with you, flourishes in the ascending spiral. Down here you are babes, with your clothes made for you, your bottles filled for you, and dependent on others for the conditions of life. But by degrees you will enter on the full responsibility and the full joy and glory of independent existence, which yet will be unified, first into the life of the affinities, the true and completed being, and then into the life of that body of Christ, of which St. Paul speaks in his prophetic moments, where there shall be neither Greek nor Jew, barbarian, Scythian, bond nor free, but Christos, the glorified and crowned humanity, shall be in all, God in man, the coping stone of the building, whose foundations were laid as man, the image and likeness of God, in God. End of section 18. End of Seen and Unseen by E. Katharine Bates.